Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she approached the shooting range at Camp Pendleton. The California sun beat down mercilessly on the concrete, and the familiar smell of gunpowder hung thick in the air. At 24, she had been working as a civilian contractor for the military for 2 years, mainly handling administrative tasks and equipment maintenance. Today was different, though. She was here to replace worn-out paper targets, a simple job that usually took her about an hour. The shooting range was busy that morning. Several groups of Marines were conducting their weekly marksmanship training, and the constant crack of rifle fire echoed across the facility. Sarah had grown accustomed to the sound, but it still made her jump occasionally. She pulled her cart of fresh targets behind her, focusing on staying out of the way of the active training exercises. As she began removing the tattered remains of old targets from the stands, Sarah couldn't help but watch the Marines practice. Their discipline and precision fascinated her. Each shooter lay prone on the ground, their rifles steady, breathing controlled. She had always wondered what it felt like to hold such a powerful weapon, to feel that level of focus and control. Sarah's father had been a hunter, and she had some experience with firearms growing up in rural Texas. But that was different, shooting at deer or targets in the woods with her dad's old hunting rifle. This was military-grade equipment, designed for warfare, operated by some of the most elite soldiers in the world. She was so absorbed in watching the training that she didn't notice someone approaching until a shadow fell across her work area. Looking up, she saw a tall man in military fatigues standing nearby. Unlike the younger Marines, this soldier had an air of experience about him. His uniform bore insignia she didn't immediately recognize, but something about his bearing suggested he was Special Forces. "You seem pretty interested in what's going on over there," the soldier said, his voice friendly but authoritative. His name tape read Johnson, and Sarah noticed the trident pin on his chest, the symbol of a Navy SEAL. Sarah felt her cheeks redden with embarrassment. "Sorry, I was just watching while I work. I didn't mean to get distracted." Johnson smiled, and his stern expression softened. "No need to apologize. I'm Chief Petty Officer Johnson. And you are?" "Sarah Martinez. I work for the base contractor, just replacing targets today." She gestured to her cart of paper targets, feeling somewhat foolish about her mundane task compared to the intense training happening around them. "How long have you been working on base?" Johnson asked, genuinely curious. "About 2 years now. I do various jobs, paperwork, equipment maintenance, supply runs. Nothing too exciting." Sarah continued pulling down the old targets, trying to focus on her work despite the conversation. Johnson watched her work for a moment before speaking again. "You ever done any shooting yourself?" "Some, back home in Texas with my father. But nothing like this," Sarah said, nodding toward the Marines on the range. "This is way beyond anything I've ever experienced." "What kind of shooting did you do?" Johnson's interest seemed genuine, not just polite conversation. Sarah paused in her work, remembering those weekend mornings with her father. "Mostly hunting, deer, wild boar. My dad taught me when I was 12. We'd go out before dawn, and he'd make me practice shooting at different distances. He was pretty strict about it, said if I was going to hunt, I needed to be accurate enough to make clean kills." "That's good foundation," Johnson said approvingly. "Hunting teaches you patience, breath control, and respect for the weapon. A lot of people don't understand that." As they talked, Sarah noticed that Johnson kept glancing at the Marines training nearby. A group of younger soldiers was struggling with their accuracy, and she could see frustration building on their faces. Their instructor was barking corrections, but several of them seemed to be developing bad habits under pressure. "Those boys are having a tough day," Johnson observed, following Sarah's gaze. "Sometimes the fundamentals get forgotten when people try too hard." Sarah nodded, remembering her own early struggles with her father's rifle. "My dad used to say that shooting was more mental than physical. He'd make me visualize the shot before taking it, imagine the bullet's path to the target." Johnson's eyebrows rose slightly. "Your father sounds like he knew what he was talking about. That's advanced thinking for recreational shooting." "He was in Vietnam," Sarah explained. "Army sniper. He never talked much about the war, but he took shooting very seriously. Said it was about respect, for the weapon, for the target, and for yourself." The conversation was interrupted by a particularly loud string of profanity from the struggling Marines. Their instructor was clearly losing patience, and the stress was making the shooters perform even worse. Sarah watched as one young Marine missed the target entirely 3 times in a row, his rifle shaking with frustration. "Mind if I ask you something?" Johnson said, his tone becoming more serious. "What do you think those Marines are doing wrong?" Sarah hesitated. Who was she to critique military training? But Johnson seemed genuinely interested in her opinion, so she studied the struggling shooters carefully. "They're rushing," she said finally. "And they're too tense. You can see it in their shoulders and the way they're gripping their rifles. My father always said tension was the enemy of accuracy." Johnson nodded approvingly. "What else?" Growing more confident, Sarah continued her analysis. "They're not following through on their shots. They're flinching before the bullet even leaves the barrel, probably anticipating the recoil. And their breathing is all wrong. They're holding their breath too long, which makes them shake." "Very observant," Johnson said, and Sarah could hear respect in his voice. "You've got a good eye for this." As if to prove her point, another Marine missed his target completely, and his instructor's voice rose even higher in frustration. The young soldier's confidence was clearly shattered, and his subsequent shots went even further off target. "It's hard to watch," Sarah said quietly. "You can see he knows what he's supposed to do, but the pressure is getting to him." Johnson was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. "You know, sometimes a fresh perspective can help break through mental blocks. These boys have been doing the same drills the same way for weeks. Maybe what they need is someone who thinks differently about shooting." Sarah wasn't sure what he meant by that, but something in his tone made her pay attention. Around them, the shooting range continued its controlled chaos, some groups performing well, others struggling with the fundamentals that seemed so simple in theory, but proved difficult under pressure. "I should get back to my targets," Sarah said, realizing she had been standing and talking for several minutes while her cart sat half empty. "Of course," Johnson said. "It was nice meeting you, Sarah. Maybe we'll run into each other again." As Johnson walked away, Sarah returned to her work with a strange feeling that their conversation had been about more than just casual interest in her background. She had noticed how he had asked specific questions about her shooting experience, and how carefully he had listened to her analysis of the struggling Marines. She finished replacing the targets efficiently, but her mind kept drifting back to the conversation. There had been something almost like an evaluation in Johnson's questions, as if he had been assessing her knowledge and understanding rather than just making small talk. By the time she finished her work, most of the morning training sessions had ended, and the range was quieting down. As Sarah packed up her supplies and prepared to return her cart to the maintenance shed, she found herself looking back at the shooting positions where the Marines had been training. The experience had awakened something in her, a desire to test herself against more challenging targets, to see if the skills her father had taught her in the Texas wilderness could translate to this more demanding environment. But that was just wishful thinking. She was a civilian contractor, here to maintain equipment and handle paperwork, not to train alongside elite military units. Still, as she walked back toward the base facilities, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her conversation with Chief Petty Officer Johnson had been significant in some way she didn't yet understand. There had been an intensity in his questions, a purpose behind his casual demeanor that suggested this encounter might not be as random as it had seemed. The sun was reaching its peak as Sarah completed her morning rounds, but the heat seemed less oppressive now. Something about the morning's events had energized her, filling her with a sense of possibility she hadn't felt in months of routine maintenance work. She didn't know it yet, but Chief Petty Officer Johnson was already forming an idea that would soon change the trajectory of her life completely. The SEAL had recognized something in Sarah's analysis of the shooting problems, a combination of technical knowledge and intuitive understanding that was rare among civilians. As Sarah returned to her regular duties for the rest of the day, she had no idea that Johnson was already making phone calls, checking protocols, and setting plans in motion that would soon put her back on that shooting range under very different circumstances. The seeds of something extraordinary had been planted in what seemed like a routine morning conversation, and they were already beginning to grow. 3 days after her encounter with Chief Petty Officer Johnson, Sarah was sitting in the base cafeteria eating lunch when her supervisor, Mike Henderson, approached her table with an unusual expression on his face. "Sarah, I need to talk to you about something," Mike said, sliding into the seat across from her. He was holding a manila folder and seemed more serious than usual. "Is everything okay? Did I mess up something on the target replacement?" Sarah asked, immediately worried that she had somehow done her job incorrectly. Mike shook his head. "No, nothing like that. Actually, this is about something completely different. I got a call this morning from the training division. They want to know if you'd be interested in participating in a special training exercise." Sarah nearly choked on her sandwich. "What kind of training exercise?" "Apparently, one of the SEAL instructors specifically requested you for a marksmanship demonstration they're conducting next week. Something about needing civilian perspectives for a training study they're running." Mike opened the folder and pulled out an official-looking document. "This is a temporary duty assignment that would give you authorization to participate in active training exercises." Sarah's mind raced back to her conversation with Johnson 3 days earlier. This couldn't be a coincidence. Did they say which instructor requested me? Chief Petty Officer Johnson. "You know him?" Mike's eyebrows raised with curiosity. "We talked briefly when I was replacing targets on Monday. I had no idea it would lead to anything like this." Sarah examined the document Mike had handed her. It was formal military paperwork, complete with official seals and authorization codes. "Well, apparently you made quite an impression. The request came through proper channels, and your security clearance is already sufficient for this type of training participation. The question is, are you interested?" Sarah's heart was pounding. Part of her was thrilled by the opportunity, but another part was terrified. What exactly would I be doing? According to the briefing notes, they want you to observe and participate in advanced marksmanship training. Apparently, they're studying how different backgrounds and approaches can improve training effectiveness. You'd be working with some of their struggling marksmen to see if your perspective helps. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. She had watched those same struggling Marines just days earlier and had unknowingly auditioned for this opportunity through her casual observations and comments to Johnson. "When would this start?" she asked. "Monday morning, 0600 hours. The exercise runs for 5 days, and you'd be working directly with SEAL training instructors and Marine marksmen. It's completely voluntary, and you'd return to your regular duties afterward." Sarah thought about her routine work, the paperwork, the equipment maintenance, the mundane daily tasks that had begun to feel increasingly unfulfilling. This was a chance to do something meaningful, something that could actually help people improve their skills. "I'll do it," she said, surprising herself with how quickly she made the decision. Mike smiled. "I thought you might. Just remember, this is going to be intense. These guys don't mess around when it comes to training." That weekend, Sarah found herself both excited and nervous about the upcoming week. She spent Saturday at a local shooting range, practicing with her own rifle to shake off any rust from her skills. The civilian range felt tame compared to the military facility, but it helped calm her nerves and rebuild her confidence. Sunday evening, she received a phone call from Chief Petty Officer Johnson himself. "Sarah, I wanted to call personally to prepare you for tomorrow. I know this might seem sudden, but I think you can make a real difference for some of these Marines. I'm honored by the opportunity, Chief. But I have to ask, why me? There must be plenty of qualified instructors already." Johnson was quiet for a moment before answering. "Sometimes people get stuck in patterns, especially when they're struggling. These particular Marines have been working with the same instructors using the same methods for weeks, and they're not improving. In fact, some of them are getting worse because their confidence is shot. And you think an outsider's perspective might help? I think your perspective might help. You analyze their problems accurately in about 5 minutes of observation. Plus, you learned to shoot from someone who understood the mental game as well as the technical aspects. That combination is exactly what these Marines need right now." Sarah felt a flutter of pride mixed with apprehension. What if I can't help them? What if I make things worse? Then, we'll try something else. "But, Sarah, I've been training Marines and SEALs for 15 years. I know potential when I see it. You have something special, a way of seeing the mechanics and the psychology of shooting that most people miss." Monday morning arrived faster than Sarah expected. She reported to the shooting range at 0545, wearing the civilian training gear that had been issued to her. The early morning air was crisp, and the range was already bustling with activity. Johnson met her at the entrance, along with another SEAL instructor she didn't recognize. Sarah, this is Petty Officer First Class Rodriguez. He'll be working with us this week. Rodriguez shook her hand firmly. Chief Johnson's told me about your background. I'm looking forward to seeing what you can do. As they walked toward the range, Johnson explained the situation in more detail. We've got 5 Marines who are having serious accuracy problems. They're all good soldiers, but they're at risk of failing their marksmanship qualifications. Traditional remedial training hasn't worked, and they're getting more frustrated every day. They approached a section of the range where 5 Marines were already set up with their rifles. Sarah could immediately see the tension in their posture, shoulders hunched, grips too tight, expressions of barely contained frustration. Marines, I want you to meet Sarah Martinez, Johnson announced. She's going to be working with us this week to try some different approaches to marksmanship training. Sarah saw skepticism in several of the Marines' faces. She was a young civilian woman about to give advice to trained military personnel. The situation would have been intimidating if not for Johnson's obvious confidence in her abilities. Before we start, Sarah said, addressing the group, I want you to know that I'm not here because I'm a better shot than any of you. I'm here because sometimes a fresh perspective can help break through mental barriers that develop during intensive training. One of the Marines, a stocky young man with the name tape Williams, spoke up. Ma'am, no disrespect, but we've been working on this for months. What makes you think you can help where our instructors haven't? It was a fair question, and Sarah appreciated his directness. You're absolutely right to be skeptical. But let me ask you something. When you're having trouble with your shooting, what's going through your mind? Williams considered the question seriously. Honestly, I'm thinking about how I can't afford to fail this qualification. I'm thinking about disappointing my unit. I'm thinking about all the shots I've already missed. And where's your focus when you're thinking about all that? Everywhere except where it should be, Williams admitted. Sarah nodded. That's exactly the problem. Your technical skills are probably fine, but your mental game is working against you. That's something I understand because I've been there myself. Over the next hour, Sarah worked with each Marine individually, watching their form, asking questions about their thought processes, and identifying specific issues that were sabotaging their performance. To her relief, the problems she identified were exactly the kind her father had taught her to recognize and correct. With Williams, the issue was anticipation. He was flinching before the shot, expecting the recoil, and disrupting his aim. With another Marine named Chun, the problem was inconsistent breathing. He was holding his breath for too long, causing his hands to shake from oxygen deprivation. But the most interesting case was Lance Corporal Jackson, a quiet young woman who seemed to have all the technical fundamentals correct, but was still missing targets consistently. As Sarah observed her shooting, she noticed something subtle that the other instructors had missed. Jackson, can you show me how you're aligning your sight picture? Sarah asked. Jackson demonstrated her sight alignment, and it looked textbook perfect. But Sarah noticed that she was closing one eye to aim, and her head position was slightly canted to compensate for her dominant eye. Which is your dominant eye? Sarah asked. My right eye, ma'am. But you're shooting left-handed. Yes, ma'am. I'm left-handed, so I was taught to shoot left-handed. Sarah exchanged a glance with Johnson, who was watching the interaction with interest. This was a classic cross-dominance issue that could cause chronic accuracy problems. Jackson, has anyone ever tested your cross-dominance? Sometimes being left-handed doesn't mean your left eye is dominant. They spent the next 20 minutes working through eye dominance tests, and, sure enough, Jackson was right eye dominant despite being left-handed. This meant that shooting left-handed was actually fighting against her natural visual alignment. What if we tried having you shoot right-handed? Sarah suggested. Jackson looked uncertain. Ma'am, I've been shooting left-handed for 2 years. Starting over seems. I know it seems backwards, Sarah said gently. But if your dominant eye is on the wrong side for your shooting stance, you're essentially fighting your own biology every time you aim. Johnson stepped forward. Jackson, you're already struggling with left-handed shooting. What do you have to lose by trying something different? The rest of the morning was spent helping Jackson adjust to a right-handed shooting stance. It was awkward at first, but within an hour, her groups on the target were tighter than they had been in months of left-handed practice. By the end of the first day, all 5 Marines had shown measurable improvement. Williams had learned breathing techniques to control his anticipation flinch. Chen had developed a consistent rhythm for his breathing pattern. Jackson was already adapting well to her new shooting stance. As they cleaned up the range that afternoon, Rodriguez pulled Sarah aside. I have to admit, I was skeptical when the chief first proposed this. But you identified problems in one day that we've been missing for weeks. It's just a different perspective, Sarah said modestly. You and Chief Johnson know far more about shooting than I do. Maybe, Rodriguez said. But sometimes being too close to a problem makes it harder to see the obvious solutions. You came in with fresh eyes and no preconceptions about how things should be done. That evening, Johnson asked Sarah to join him for coffee in the base cafe. How do you feel about the first day? He asked. Honestly, better than I expected. I was worried I'd get in there and have no idea how to help anyone. And now? Sarah considered the question carefully. Now I think I understand why you asked me to do this. These Marines don't need more technical instruction. They need someone to help them get out of their own heads. Johnson smiled. Exactly. And that's something you understand intuitively because of how you learned to shoot. Your father taught you the mental game alongside the physical skills. As they talked, Sarah realized that this week was about more than just helping 5 struggling Marines improve their marksmanship. It was about discovering capabilities in herself that she had never fully recognized or developed. Chief, can I ask you something? What happens after this week? Johnson leaned back in his chair, studying her face. That depends on how the rest of the week goes. But I'll tell you this, what you did today was impressive. You have natural teaching instincts and a deep understanding of the psychology of marksmanship that's rare in civilian or military circles. Sarah felt a stirring of possibility, a sense that this temporary assignment might be the beginning of something much larger and more meaningful than she had ever imagined. But, for now, she was content to focus on the next 4 days and the Marines who were counting on her to help them succeed. The foundation had been laid for something extraordinary, though Sarah didn't yet realize just how extraordinary it would become. By Wednesday of the training week, word had spread throughout the base about the civilian contractor who was helping struggling Marines improve their marksmanship. Sarah arrived at the range that morning to find not only her original 5 Marines, but also several observers from other units who had come to see what all the talk was about. Chief Johnson met her at the equipment shed, carrying 2 rifles instead of his usual one. We've got a bigger audience today, he said, nodding toward the observation area where a small crowd of instructors and officers had gathered. No pressure, right? Sarah said, trying to keep her voice light despite the butterflies in her stomach. Actually, there is some pressure today, Johnson admitted. Colonel Martinez from the training command is here. He's been hearing reports about our unconventional approach, and he wants to see results for himself. Sarah's stomach dropped. A colonel observing her work was far beyond anything she had prepared for. What if the Marines don't perform well today? What if yesterday was just a fluke? Then, we'll deal with that if it happens. But, Sarah, look at your Marines. Sarah followed Johnson's gaze to where Williams, Chun, Jackson, and the other 2 Marines were preparing their equipment. The change in their demeanor was obvious even from a distance. Where there had been tension and frustration on Monday, she now saw focus and confidence. They were talking among themselves, sharing tips and encouragement rather than dwelling on their failures. They believe in themselves again, Johnson continued. That's not something you can fake, and it's not something that disappears overnight. The morning session began with the standard qualification course that all Marines had to pass. Each Marine would fire 40 rounds at targets ranging from 200 to 500 yards, with strict time limits and accuracy requirements. Sarah watched from the instructor area as her 5 Marines took their positions alongside other Marines who were also attempting to qualify. Williams was first up. Sarah could see him implementing the breathing techniques they had worked on, taking his time to settle into each shot rather than rushing through the sequence. His first group of shots was tight and well-centered, a dramatic improvement from the scattered patterns he had been shooting just days earlier. Lance Corporal Jackson followed, using her new right-handed stance. There was still some awkwardness in her positioning, but her accuracy was remarkable. Where she had been missing targets entirely the previous week, she was now hitting center mass consistently. Chun had overcome his breathing inconsistencies and was shooting with a steady rhythm that kept his hands stable throughout the course of fire. The other two Marines, Peterson and Rodriguez, had made similar improvements in their specific problem areas. As the morning progressed, it became clear that all 5 Marines were not just passing their qualification, they were excelling. The observers were taking notes, and Sarah could see animated discussions happening in the observation area. Colonel Martinez approached Sarah during a break between courses of fire. He was a lean, weathered man in his 50s with the kind of commanding presence that made even civilian contractors stand straighter. "Ms. Martinez, I've been watching your work this week with considerable interest. Chief Johnson tells me you have no formal military training background." "That's correct, sir. I learned to shoot from my father, who was a Vietnam veteran, but all my training was civilian hunting and recreational shooting. Yet you've accomplished in 3 days what our standard remedial training hadn't achieved in 3 months. How do you explain that?" Sarah had been dreading this question, but she had given it considerable thought over the past few days. "Sir, I think sometimes being outside the system lets you see problems that people inside the system might overlook. These Marines weren't failing because they didn't know the technical fundamentals. They were failing because mental barriers were preventing them from applying what they already knew. And your solution was to address the mental barriers rather than repeat the technical training?" "Yes, sir. Each Marine had a different psychological issue that was sabotaging their performance. Williams was anticipating recoil. Jackson was fighting her natural eye dominance. Chen was creating instability through inconsistent breathing patterns. Once we identified and addressed those specific mental blocks, their existing technical skills could emerge." Colonel Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "Chief Johnson, what's your assessment of Ms. Martinez's methods?" "Sir, in my 15 years of training Marines and SEALs, I've rarely seen such rapid improvement in struggling marksmen. Ms. Martinez has an intuitive understanding of both the technical and psychological aspects of marksmanship that's exceptional. Have you considered expanding this approach beyond remedial training?" Sarah's pulse quickened. The conversation seemed to be heading in a direction she hadn't expected. "Actually, sir," Johnson replied, "I was hoping to discuss that with you. I believe Ms. Martinez could be valuable in developing new training methodologies for all our marksmanship programs." The afternoon session involved advanced shooting exercises that went beyond basic qualification requirements. Sarah found herself working alongside Johnson and Rodriguez as they pushed the Marines through increasingly challenging scenarios. The exercise that drew the most attention involved precision shooting at extended ranges. The Marines were required to hit targets at 600 and 800 yards, distances that demanded perfect technique and mental discipline. These were shots that separated competent marksmen from truly skilled ones. Jackson stepped up to the 800-yard line first. She had made such rapid progress with her new shooting stance that Johnson had decided to challenge her with the most demanding shots of the week. Sarah stood beside her, offering quiet guidance about wind reading and ballistic calculations. "Remember," Sarah said softly, "at this distance, everything matters. Breathing, trigger control, follow through. But don't overthink it. Trust your fundamentals, and let the shot happen naturally." Jackson settled into position, her new right-handed stance now looking much more natural than it had just days earlier. She took her time reading the wind flags, made her adjustments, and settled into her final aiming position. The shot broke cleanly, and through the spotting scope, Sarah could see the bullet impact near the center of the target. The small crowd of observers erupted in appreciative murmurs. For a Marine who had been failing basic qualification just a week earlier, hitting an 800-yard target was extraordinary. Williams followed with similarly impressive results at 600 yards, and Chen managed to keep all his shots within the scoring rings at the longest distance despite never having attempted such challenging shots before. But it was what happened next that truly caught everyone's attention. Colonel Martinez approached Sarah with a different kind of request. "Ms. Martinez, I'd like you to demonstrate your own shooting ability. We've seen what you can teach, but I'm curious about your personal skill level." Sarah felt her mouth go dry. She had been coaching and observing all week, but she hadn't actually fired a shot herself in front of the military personnel. The thought of shooting in front of a colonel and a group of elite instructors was terrifying. "Sir, I'm not sure that's necessary. My role here has been to help others, not to show off. I understand your modesty, the colonel replied. But humor me. I'm considering some recommendations that would require me to understand your full capabilities. Johnson stepped forward, carrying one of the precision rifles they had been using for the long-range exercises. Sarah, remember what you've been telling the Marines all week. Trust your fundamentals and don't overthink it. As Sarah took the rifle, she noticed that all activity on the range had stopped. Marines, instructors, and observers were all watching to see how the civilian contractor would perform under pressure. She had fired similar rifles before, but never in such a high-stakes environment. As she settled into shooting position, Sarah tried to apply her own advice. She focused on her breathing, established a natural point of aim, and began reading the wind conditions. The target was at 800 yards, the same distance Jackson had just successfully engaged. Sarah took her time, feeling the weight of all those watching eyes, but gradually settling into the focused state her father had taught her years earlier. When the shot broke, it surprised even her. The rifle recoiled smoothly, and she maintained her sight picture through the follow-through. In the spotting scope, she could see a clean hit near the center of the target. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever before Colonel Martinez spoke. Outstanding shot, Ms. Martinez. Chief Johnson, I think we need to have a serious conversation about Ms. Martinez's future role here. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of successful shooting exercises and increasingly impressed observers. By the end of the day, all 5 of Sarah's Marines had not only passed their qualifications but had achieved scores that ranked them among the better marksmen in their units. As they cleaned equipment and prepared to secure the range, Jackson approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. Ma'am, I can't thank you enough. A week ago, I thought I was going to wash out of the Marines because I couldn't shoot. Today I hit an 800-yard target on my first try. You always had the ability, Sarah replied. You just needed to get out of your own way and let it happen. Williams, Chun, and the other Marines expressed similar gratitude, but what struck Sarah most was the transformation in their confidence. They weren't just better shooters now, they were better Marines, with renewed faith in their abilities and their potential for continued improvement. That evening, Colonel Martinez, Chief Johnson, and Sarah met privately in the base conference room. The colonel carried a thick folder of documents, and his expression was serious but positive. Ms. Martinez, I'm going to be direct. What I've observed this week has convinced me that you have exceptional talent as a marksmanship instructor. Your methods are unorthodox, but undeniably effective. Sarah waited, sensing that something significant was about to be proposed. I'm prepared to offer you a position as a civilian marksmanship consultant with our training command. You would work directly with our most challenging cases, develop new training methodologies, and help us improve our overall marksmanship program effectiveness. The offer was beyond anything Sarah had ever imagined when she first approached that shooting range to replace paper targets. Sir, I'm honored, but I have to ask, what would this position entail exactly? You would have access to all our training facilities, work with our best instructors, and have the authority to implement new approaches to marksmanship training. You'd also have the opportunity to attend advanced training courses to further develop your own skills. Johnson added, Sarah, this is a chance to do something meaningful, something that could help hundreds of Marines and SEALs become better marksmen and potentially save lives in the field. As Sarah considered the offer, she thought about her routine maintenance work, her quiet life as a base contractor, and the sense of purpose she had discovered over the past few days. The choice seemed obvious, but the magnitude of the opportunity was almost overwhelming. I need to think about this, she said finally. When do you need an answer? Take the weekend, Colonel Martinez replied. But I'll tell you this, opportunities like this don't come along often, and talent like yours is rare. As Sarah left the meeting, her mind was spinning with possibilities. In less than a week, she had gone from replacing paper targets to being offered a position that could change the trajectory of her entire career. The final day of training loomed ahead, but she already knew that by Friday afternoon, her life would be fundamentally different than it had been the previous Monday morning. Friday morning arrived with an electric tension that Sarah had never experienced on the shooting range before. Word of her proposed position had somehow leaked through the base's informal communication network, and The observation area was packed with personnel from multiple units. Today wasn't just the final day of training for her 5 Marines. It was essentially an audition for her future role in military marksmanship training. Chief Johnson met her at the armory with an expression that mixed excitement with concern. "Sarah, I need to prepare you for what's happening today. This has become bigger than any of us anticipated." "How much bigger?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew from the unusual level of activity she had seen around the base that morning. "We've got observers from SEAL Team Training Commands, Marine Sniper Schools, and even some representatives from other branches of the military. What started as a small experiment in alternative training methods has turned into a demonstration that could influence marksmanship training throughout the military." Sarah felt her stomach tighten with nerves. "No pressure, right?" Johnson smiled, but his tone remained serious. "Actually, there is significant pressure today. If this goes well, it could validate everything we've been working toward. If it goes poorly, it could end before it really begins." As they walked toward the range, Sarah could see the elaborate setup that had been prepared. Multiple shooting lanes were configured for various distances and scenarios. Electronic scoring systems had been installed to provide real-time feedback. Most intimidating of all, a panel of senior officers was seated in the observation area, including some ranks she had never seen before. Her 5 Marines were already at the range, and she was relieved to see that they appeared calm and focused despite the increased attention. Williams was methodically checking his equipment. Jackson was dry-firing her rifle to warm up her new right-handed technique, and Chun was practicing the breathing exercises they had developed together. "How are you feeling?" Sarah asked as she joined the group. "Ready," Williams replied with a confidence that would have been unimaginable a week earlier. "We know what we can do now. The audience doesn't change that." Jackson nodded in agreement. "Ma'am, you taught us to focus on the fundamentals and trust our training. That's what we're going to do today." The morning session began with the standard qualification course, but the scoring was more rigorous than anything Sarah had previously observed. Each shot was immediately scored and displayed on large electronic boards visible to all observers. There would be no hiding marginal performance or making excuses for poor results. One by one, her Marines stepped to the firing line and delivered performances that exceeded even Sarah's optimistic expectations. Williams shot a perfect score on the basic qualification, something he had never achieved before their training began. Jackson's accuracy with her new stance was remarkable. She not only passed, but scored in the top 10% of all Marines who had taken the qualification that year. Chun, Peterson, and Rodriguez all demonstrated similar levels of improvement, turning in scores that would have been impossible for them just days earlier. The electronic scoring boards showed a level of consistency and accuracy that was drawing appreciative comments from the observer panel. But the real test came during the afternoon's advanced exercises. These scenarios were designed to challenge experienced marksmen and were typically used only for special operations training. Sarah had never seen Marines with just basic qualifications attempt such demanding shoots. The first advanced exercise involved engaging multiple targets at varying distances under time pressure. Sarah watched nervously as Williams took position for his run. This was far beyond anything they had practiced together, and failure here would be highly visible to all the assembled observers. Williams surprised everyone, including himself, by completing the course with only 1 miss out of 12 shots. His technique remained solid under pressure, and he maintained the breathing control that had been his biggest challenge just days earlier. Jackson followed with an even more impressive performance, hitting all 12 targets in a time that would have been respectable for an experienced sniper. Her transformation from failing basic qualifications to excelling at advanced scenarios was so dramatic that Sarah noticed several officers taking detailed notes and asking questions about her specific training modifications. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah found herself working more closely with Chief Johnson and the other SEAL instructors. They were treating her less like a guest observer and more like a fellow instructor, asking for her input on training methodologies and her assessment of various shooting techniques. It was during the final exercise of the day that the moment occurred that would become legendary in the base's shooting range folklore. The exercise was extreme long-range precision shooting at 1,000 yards, a distance that challenged even experienced snipers and was typically attempted only by the most elite marksmen. The target was barely visible to the naked eye, and success required perfect technique, precise environmental calculations, and exceptional mental discipline. Johnson had originally planned to demonstrate this exercise himself, but as the afternoon progressed, an idea had been forming in his mind. The assembled observers were already impressed with Sarah's teaching abilities and the improvement in her Marines, but he sensed an opportunity to demonstrate something even more significant. "Sarah," Johnson said quietly as they prepared for the long-range demonstration, "I want you to take this shot." Sarah felt her heart skip. "Chief, that's a 1,000-yard shot in front of half the base leadership. I've never even attempted anything that challenging." "That's exactly why you should take it," Johnson replied. "Everyone here has seen what you can teach others. Now they need to see what you can do yourself." Before Sarah could protest further, Johnson was addressing the assembled group. "Ladies and gentlemen, for our final demonstration today, Ms. Martinez will attempt the 1,000-yard precision shot." The announcement created a stir among the observers. Sarah could hear murmured conversations about the appropriateness of having a civilian attempt such a challenging shot, especially one that many military marksmen would find difficult. Colonel Martinez stood and addressed the group. "I think this is an excellent capstone to the week's demonstrations. Ms. Martinez has shown us new approaches to training. Now let's see how well those approaches work for the instructor herself." As Sarah approached the shooting position, she was acutely aware that this single shot could define how her entire week of work was perceived. Success would validate everything she had been teaching and potentially secure her future role in military training. Failure would undermine her credibility and possibly end the program before it really began. Johnson handed her his personal rifle, a precision instrument that she had watched him use for similar shots throughout the week. As her hands closed around the familiar weight of the weapon, she noticed that the entire range had gone quiet. Even the Marines from other training exercises had stopped their activities to watch. "Remember everything you've been teaching," Johnson said quietly. "Focus on the fundamentals, control your breathing, and trust your training." Sarah settled into the shooting position, feeling the rough concrete of the firing line beneath her elbows. The 1,000-yard target was a small speck through the rifle scope, barely larger than a pinhead at that distance. Environmental factors became critical at this range: wind speed and direction, temperature, humidity, even the rotation of the earth could affect bullet flight. She took her time reading the wind flag strung between her position and the target. A gentle breeze was moving from left to right, requiring her to aim slightly into the wind to compensate for bullet drift. The temperature was warm, which would increase bullet velocity slightly compared to the rifle's zero conditions. As Sarah settled behind the scope and began her final aiming sequence, she found herself thinking about her father's hunting lessons years earlier. He had taught her that at long range, patience was more important than technique. "Take all the time you need," he had always said. "The target will wait for you." The crosshairs settled on the center of the distant target, and Sarah began her breathing cycle. Inhale, exhale, halfway, hold, squeeze. The trigger broke cleanly, surprising her, as all good shots did. The rifle recoiled smoothly, and she maintained her sight picture through the follow-through. For several seconds that felt like hours, everyone waited for the shot to be called through the radio connection to the target pit. Finally, the voice crackled through the speaker system. "Hit, center ring. Excellent shot." The silence that followed was broken by spontaneous applause from the observer area. Sarah looked up from the scope to see Chief Johnson grinning broadly, Colonel Martinez nodding with obvious approval, and her 5 Marines cheering enthusiastically. "Outstanding shot, Ms. Martinez," Johnson said as he helped her to her feet. "That's a shot that many of our most experienced snipers would be proud of." As the day's activities concluded and equipment was cleaned and secured, Sarah found herself surrounded by officers and instructors who wanted to discuss her training methods and the remarkable improvements they had witnessed in her Marines. The conversations were no longer about whether she was qualified for a role in military training, but rather about how quickly she could start and what resources she would need. Colonel Martinez approached her as the crowd began to disperse. "Ms. Martinez, I don't think I need to wait for your decision about our offer. What I've seen today convinces me that you could revolutionize how we approach marksmanship training. Sir, I have to admit that I'm still somewhat overwhelmed by all of this. A week ago, I was replacing paper targets. Today I'm being offered a position that could influence training throughout the military. Sometimes the most significant changes come from unexpected sources, the colonel replied. Your background outside traditional military training gives you perspectives that we need. The question is, are you ready to take on that responsibility? Sarah looked around the range where she had spent the week discovering capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. Her 5 Marines were packing their equipment with confidence and pride that hadn't been there just days earlier. Chief Johnson was discussing expanded training programs with other instructors. The entire atmosphere had changed from one of routine qualification requirements to one of genuine enthusiasm for marksmanship excellence. Yes, sir, Sarah said finally. I'm ready. As she walked off the range that afternoon, Sarah realized that Chief Johnson's decision to hand her his rifle for that final shot had been about more than demonstrating her shooting ability. It had been a symbolic transfer of responsibility, a recognition that she had earned her place among the military's training professionals. The week that had begun with a chance encounter while replacing targets had ended with Sarah finding her true calling. She had discovered that her father's hunting lessons and her intuitive understanding of the mental game of shooting could be transformed into something much larger and more meaningful. 3 months later, Sarah would be working with elite military units throughout the country, developing training programs that would improve marksmanship scores across multiple branches of service. Her methods would be studied and replicated at training facilities around the world. But, in that moment, walking away from the range where everything had changed, Sarah simply felt grateful that Chief Johnson had seen something in a civilian contractor that even she hadn't recognized. The rifle had changed hands, and, with it, the trajectory of her entire life. Years later, when young Marines and SEALs would ask her about her most important piece of shooting advice, Sarah would always return to the same fundamental truth her father had taught her in the Texas wilderness. Trust your training, control your mind, and, when the moment comes, let the shot happen naturally. The rifle had found its way into the right hands after all,